Well, hello, everyone. This is Mark Turi, and welcome to my Saturday evening for me live. Of course, if you're joining me from the US and Canada, it's probably afternoon, somewhere around 12 to 3 p.m. in North America and most of South America, if I have any viewers there. But for Europe, it's at least, I guess, 8 p.m. So good evening, good afternoon. And yeah, welcome to the second part of my two-part series. So this is the final part of my series of the what I called the sort of the rise of nationalism and revolution in Germany following the First World War. Of course, last time we did part one, where I focused on what was called the German Civil War and German Revolution from 1918 until 1919. If you haven't, please go and check out that video, which is actually doing pretty well. When I get to later in just a moment, I'll get to our sort of what I call house cleaning small talk, and I'll talk a little bit about my channel analytics for those who are interested. May not be the best or most interesting topic, but it's been actually quite a good couple weeks on my channel. Been growing, quite slowly, but still good. And so, yeah, I discussed the Spartacus uprising as well as the establishment of the Bavarian Soviet Republic from 1918, excuse me, from 1919, I should say, and some of the revolutionary fervor going on in 1918, 19, and so forth. Today, in the second part, we are going to talk about the rise of National Socialism in Germany. I'm going to introduce you to some historical actors. We're going to talk about culture, anti-Semitism. We're also going to talk about a couple of events that are very interesting and influential to the rise of National Socialism in Germany and so forth. So, again, this will conclude in the second part. Um, just popping on here. Hey, Irish Mart, how are you doing? I'm so glad you're here. As always, thank you so much for being here. You are a very good and very loyal and steady follower of my content. I appreciate it very, very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you had a start of a great weekend. I hope you continue to have a great weekend. I also hope that since we last saw you on Wednesday, I hope you're doing well. Um, but yeah, of course, this will be part two of two. And then next week, I will go on to another PowerPoint, which I will talk about, um, shortly. But yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for watching on the replay. And as always, please, if you haven't liked my video yet, please give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, please consider doing so by liking and subscribing. I am live, our usual schedule for those that are new. I do two lives per week, one on Wednesday, 12 p.m. noon on the Pacific time zone in the US and Canada, 3 p.m., of course, in the Eastern time zone, 8 p.m. in the UK, and the same time zones and the same times, of course, now on Saturdays. And if I have another schedule, as I did in the last couple weeks, I will tell you. But this is our normal regular times. Also, for those who are new, on Wednesdays I normally do kind of an off the cuff, sort of giving my thoughts about a particular topic that can pertain to philosophy, history, so forth. I've talked about science versus scientism, biological versus social determinism. I've talked about last week pseudosciences and confirmation bias. So things that I kind of hear in rumblings in the internet space that I have for a long time that I've done some research on, and I usually just give my thoughts, try to add a different perspective, try to break them down. And then what I like to do on Saturdays is do more of a formal structure with some kind of PowerPoint. And next week, I will have a PowerPoint which will be on the Russian ethnic minorities in the nations of the former Soviet Union. So we're going to take a look at minorities, Russian ethnic minorities in the Baltic states, in Eastern Europe, in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia, and talk a little bit about their numbers, their statistics, and things like this. And then also look into conflict zones in Georgia, Ukraine, a little bit in Ukraine. I'm not an expert, so I don't want to get into that too much, but we will talk about the Russian community there a little bit. And then we also will talk about breakaway states and so forth. And we will really look at some of the ethnic communities and some of their desires and culture and their economy a little bit. But really, it'll just be an overview of these ethnic minorities and especially statistics on certain percentages that are in certain areas. So I hope you all enjoy that as well. I will be, as I always do, after this, possibly tomorrow, I'll put two topics up on my community tab, which you can vote for, that I will then discuss on Wednesday. So I'll have two topics. It'll be something related maybe to Scientology, maybe outside the realm. I do have some topics brewing in my mind. It might also be based on things that were downvoted, I guess you could say, or didn't win the polls in previous weeks. So please look out for those. In other responsive news too, I did put, or in other news, I should say, I did put on a poll recently on whether or not I should make a Discord server for the community, and it got overwhelmingly said no. So what I think I'll do is, if there's anyone out there who's watching right now or the replay who knows Discord, I don't really know Discord. I may just post some Discord or post make some Discord posts, excuse me, of my own content to reach more people, as well as in Reddit, but I don't really use them. So if anyone has any ideas on how to do that, if you've done that before, like setting up an account and so forth, you can just reach me. You can message me on the community tab, and then obviously if there's another way to private message me or direct message me, please do that as well. I'm familiar with Discord. I have been on a little bit, and I'm also familiar with Reddit, which I have been on a little bit. So I'd really like to reach an audience. And before I get into just not really too much as far as like small talk is concerned. Weather's been nice here. I got my flu shot yesterday. I mentioned, don't think I've mentioned this before, but last December, so almost a year from now, the first week of December, I came down with a horrible, horrible flu. It was not COVID, although I did get COVID checks a bunch of times. It wasn't COVID, but it was bad. I had a very high fever, about 101, 102 max. And it took about a month for me to recover because I had a lot of dehydration due to some of the symptoms and a high fever and sweating and so forth. And I neglected to take my flu shot, which I do get every year because, I'm just I guess, at risk from getting the flu. And I've had the flu a lot even when I was younger in my 20s, and of course I'd be able to kick it in a couple days. But being over 40 now, body's kind of slowing down. And if you have a flu shot in your area, please, the pharmacy, a hospital, a clinic, get that checked out because I mean, even at 40, which I was last year, 41 this year, that was a rough month if I had a job or if I was in school or something, because it was during my vacation break. That put my life on hold for a month. So I'm very happy at least I got that done yesterday. I just want to share a couple of analytics before we get on, as I mentioned before we get on to our presentation. I want to say hello to Power Lies, the Paralyzed. I love that name. How are you? I'm glad you're here. It's always good to see you as well. I got you and Irish here today, so I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support. As of right now, I'm about 120 subscribers, which is excellent. And if I'm just looking at my lives, which I just want to do in one moment here, I've had some interesting, jumps. So first of all, my my last the last PowerPoint presentation I did last week on the German Revolution and Civil War now sits at 120 views, and so far that is the most viewed of all of my lives. And the confirmation bias and its relationship to pseudoscience, which I did just a couple days ago on Wednesday, now has 55 views, which is really cool. And the most watched video is still my history of the Romanian language, which is sitting at 170 views, and I'm at over 1,100 views in total. Past 100, and I'm close to 230 watch hours. So again, little sprints and little dabblings of success. I've been doing a lot more tabs. That was another reason. A couple weeks ago, I started adding tabs, and I guess that worked because I've been putting more tabs on Germany, German history, and philosophy and religion, and I seem to be getting some traction. I still hope to go on to other lives in the SBTV community. I'm making some, I'm trying to get some contacts out there, so again I can get more traction. But of course, I thank everyone for being here. I thank everyone who's been here since the beginning. And yeah, just again, thank you all for your support. I hope, first of all, that you had been having a great day. I hope you've had a great week, and I do hope that you're also getting something out of my lives, which I know a few of you are, and I'm getting some good comments from people that I know, people that I don't know, and so it's really amazing. So again, thank you so much. And then we're going to start with our PowerPoint right now. Now, when I start with the PowerPoint, I'm going to have to go full screen, which means I can't see the chat. But like last week, every few minutes or so, I'll go back to normal screen where I can see the chat, and then I can pick up on your comments or your questions. So please, if you have anything, comments, questions, concerns, remarks, whatever, please type them into the chat. And as always, if you're watching this on the replay, same thing. Any comments, questions, concerns, remarks, need for more information, etc. Please type that into the comments, and I think I've replied to like every comment that I've had on this channel, and I will keep doing that in the future. So let's get to my PowerPoint. I'm going to go full screen now. I'll be back to the regular screen in just a few minutes. So as I mentioned last week, I wrote a paper a couple years ago called Revolution and Counter-Revolution, Communism and Nationalism in Germany, 1918 to 1923. It was my honors thesis. It was a 15-page paper. I talked, of course, in the first half what I talked about last week, and now we're going to do it this week. And I've also presented this particular PowerPoint around 4 years ago to another group and did it in two parts like I did here. So this is the last part. So how we're going to start off today is, of course, we're going to start off around 1919. We know from the last PowerPoint that in in January of that year, we have the Spartacist uprising. Rosa Luxemburg talked about that. Her and her colleague, Karl Liebknecht, are killed in Berlin by the Freikorps. Then a few months later in April, the Bavarian Soviet Republic is established, and then it is also countered and destroyed by the Freikorps, that time in Bavaria, in Munich. And so I wanted to start off with an expansion of who were these people? Who were these people that came into Berlin armed and then successfully took over Berlin from the Spartacus League, and also ended up killing and executing Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And then they did the same in Bavaria, And in the summer of 1919, they also executed Eugene Levine, who was the second president of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. So again, who were the Freikorps? Well, if you know anything about German, we're just going to say frei means free, and Korps would be like an organization. So if we think of it today, we might associate this as a paramilitary group. So these individuals were not actually regular army troops, they were not military troops. They maybe you could say are similar to a National Guard unit, but also not. So they're more like paramilitary. And on the left here, you can see an enrollment poster. And what I want you to notice about the enrollment poster, not the German writing, you don't have to worry about that. It's just recruiting people to come serve. But you can see here that I guess we could see the man here is a student. So this is supposed to be a student. Many of them were in high school or college age, so anywhere from 16 maybe to 22, 25. And what they're supposed to be showing here is that they were studying at their desk, and you can see that there's a casual hat like a fedora on the desk with what kind of looks like some kind of typewriter, something like this. There's, of course, a rifle at the desk, and then you can see that the student is changing from their student clothing into a German uniform, which is that gray trench coat kind of thing, slacks, shoes, and of course, they have the helmet on. And so that was the idea. The idea was you were a student in, let's say, your personal life and then your public life rather, or you would then go and be recruited. You would get a phone call, a telegram, and they would say, meet here, and there would be some kind of officer, and then they would go and they went to Berlin and they went to Munich to fight for the homeland. So very much a citizen soldiers, very much in a sense a militia or paramilitary organization. It's also worth noting that the German people during this time did not really like the Freikorps, especially the Weimar Republic, because they weren't really centralized. And the Weimar Republic, I mentioned earlier too, I mentioned last week, I should say, that a lot of their military guns and weapons and ships and navy and planes and stuff were deliberate were destroyed and debilitated by the armistice. So these were sort of in some cases the only people who would fight locally, and they were not really together. They were not really unified, and they many times were up to no good. But I did want to mention that there were some famous members of the Freikorps, all of which, in these cases, in these five cases, would go on to become very high ranking and influential Nazis before and after the Second World War. So we're going to start with Martin Bormann. And I'm got on my phone here some facts. I think this might be interesting to expand some of these things and to look at who these people were and what their motivations may have been. But Martin Bormann, again, a member of the Freikorps, so which was after World War One. Well, Martin Ludwig Bormann was a Nazi Party official and the head of the Nazi Party chancellery, and he was also the private secretary of Adolf Hitler. He's considered a war criminal. So he was the Nazi Party minister, chief of the chancellery, and he ended up committing suicide in Berlin in 1945 as the war was coming to an end and as the Red Army was approaching Hitler in Hitler's bunker. He didn't commit suicide in Hitler's bunker, but somehow outside of it. And of course, it's kind of shrouded a little bit in mystery, but he did take his own life. So he was a very high ranking Nazi. And after his death, during the Nuremberg trials, he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The second person is Rudolf Hess. and he was a German politician and a leading member of the Nazi Party. He was appointed the deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler from 1933 to 1941. He also was the Reichsminister, the chief of the Nazi Party liaison officer. He was also secretary to Hitler. And interestingly enough, I guess, Hess was born in Alexandria, Egypt. He survived the war and he actually died by suicide in 1987 at the age of 93 in Spandau prison. So, again, a very high ranking person there. Another Freikorps member was Reinhard Heydrich, who was the deputy protector of Bohemia and Moravia at the time, which today is the Czech Republic. They were, of course, a puppet state for the Nazis. They were called the Protectorate. And Reinhard Heydrich was the deputy protector, the deputy person in charge. Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in 1942 by the Czech resistance in Prague. You can see a movie starring Cillian Murphy, the Irishman, who's also an Oscar winner. Cillian Murphy called Anthropoid. It's actually a very, very interesting and good movie that depicts that event. And Reinhard Heydrich is also considered to be one of the architects of the Holocaust, who took part in the Wannsee Conference. And if you've ever seen a movie called Conspiracy with Kenneth Branagh, one of my favorite Irish actors, and Stanley Tucci, one of my favorite American actors. I've also been to the Wannsee House. Wannsee is a lake near Berlin, and this is where a number of high-ranking Nazis met in, I believe, 1941 to plan the final solution. And Reinhard Heydrich was an influential member of that as well. I believe in the movie Conspiracy that he is played by Stanley Tucci. After this, we have Heinrich Himmler, probably the most influential and most famous Nazi of this list. One of the most powerful men. He was chief of German police. He was the Reichsminister of the Interior. And of course, he would be tried at the Nuremberg trials, but he committed suicide in his cell. So, also considered one of the architects behind the Holocaust. He was a member of the Freikorps. And the final person is a man named Ernst Röhm. And Ernst Röhm, okay, was a friend of Hitler's that co-founded what was called the Arbeitlung, I should say, Arbeitlung, which was the SA, which then developed into the SS. So the Arbeitlung was the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, and he also played a significant role in Hitler's rise to power. However, in the early 1930s, from 31 to 34, he began to become very radical. And there's an event in German history called the Night of Long Knives, in which Adolf Hitler purged many of his rivals after becoming both chancellor and president of Germany. And Ernst Röhm, being one of the most influential at the time, was murdered in a plot that was actually conducted by Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler. So, all of these five men were members of the Freikorps. This is where a lot of these Freikorps members, whether they participated in the events in Berlin or Bavaria, I'm not exactly sure, but they were all part of this military wing, which leaned very heavily towards the right, towards either monarchism or German nationalism. And the Freikorps is instrumental in the Nazis' rise to power, as well as the development of, again, the SA, which becomes the SS. And of course, the Nazis would utilize many paramilitary organizations, such as the Hitler Youth, in order to terrorize and victimize the people of Germany and to whichever part of the world they invaded. So, North Africa, Southern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Scandinavia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, for example, if it's just coincidence that these, 5 high-ranking members just happened to be Freikorps members. There obviously were Nazis that weren't. There also were people that were, or individuals, I should say, individual German men who were Freikorps members who didn't join the Nazi Party. Some did join the Nazi Party. But I do think that there's at least some overlap in the intellectual and ideological associations between these two, meaning that both the Freikorps and both the Nazis were very paranoid of losing Germany losing control to leftists, communists, Jews, and so on. So I do think that there definitely is some overlap. Um, even though, may or may not be direct. Next, I want to introduce you to someone who I think is a little bit overlooked sometimes in history, maybe for good reason. I don't really know. I just think this is interesting. Um, but for many of us, we know that when we learn about Hitler and we learn about Germany, we know that when he was ahead of the Nazi Party, it's because he had taken over and was a member of another party. And that party was called the German Workers' Party, okay? Which in German is called the Deutsches Arbeiterpartei, the DAP, DAP. Well, where did this party come from? This party was started in 1919, and I have a slide after this that goes into more detail about that. And it was started by 4 men, one of which is a man called Anton Drexler, who lived from 1884 until 1942. Anton Drexler was not a soldier during World War One. He had medical issues, so he did not fight in the front lines. But like many Germans, he was a skilled tradesman. He was a locksmith by trade. And following the First World War, so that's November 1918, until the party was founded in the early part of 1919, like many other Germans, they saw that a lot of the German soldiers were coming home. There was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of unemployment, and it was very difficult for tradesmen like him to get work. So the German Workers' Party is really, if you think, kind of the opposite of like a union party or a socialist workers' party. So a socialist workers' party would say, okay, we want unions, we want more uh, employment, more jobs, and we want everyone in an egalitarian way, whether you are natural born, immigrant, refugee, man, woman, gay, straight, etc. Okay, it would be more of an egalitarian party. The German Workers' Party said, no, forget it. We're only looking out for the Germans. So no unions, no international unions. There were many skilled German workers in different fields that were unemployed. Forget the Jews, forget immigrants, forget Slavs, forget women. And we, the Germans, need workers. So this is when they say German Workers' Party. They're only representing the German workers. They want jobs for Germans. They want benefits for German workers. So it's very much a nationalistic as opposed to an egalitarian workers' party. And that, of course, would mean that it's on the right wing because it's focusing not on egalitarianism, but more exclusion. If they don't care about Polish immigrants, they don't care about even communists in some cases. So that's why him and the 3 other men who founded the party, that was really one of their many desires, was to represent the German worker, but not all workers. Let me just take a look at the chat. Okay, everybody, thank you for being here. We got 4 people. Say hi. I'll come back in a moment. Okay. So the Weimar Republic is established, and almost right away there's resistance. As I mentioned, one of the resistance comes from the fact that the German army had to destroy so much of their military, their equipment, their munitions, their arms. There was a buffer zone in the Rhineland that was taken over by the League of Nations. So, it was called Neutral Rhineland, which eventually Adolf Hitler incorporated back into Germany, which is actually one of the first things he did as leader of Germany in the early 30s, was to remilitarize this demilitarized zone that existed between the French and German border of Alsace, and what's called the Saarland. You can see on a photo. But also these, again, what I talked about last week with these two kind of communist revolutions and civil wars. So the German Workers' Party is one of those parties that is founded pretty quickly. Within 2 months after the war ends. I mentioned Anton Drexler. And throughout 1919, we have the Berlin Revolution, we have the Bavarian Revolution, and people are, you know, pretty uh, maybe paranoid. They're perplexed in some ways. There's a lot of unease and unsteadiness. So, one of the most interesting things about Adolf Hitler um, is that he finds himself, he was a corporal in the German army. He saw action on the front lines. He came home, just like other men that came home. The increase of unemployment, the increase of shell shocked, as they used to call them, veterans who were begging on the streets for money, the lack of services, the lack of stability. And the Weimar Republic really shocked him. And of course, Germany was then told that they were the um, the loser. They lost the war. Initially, they believed they had only just had an armistice, but as 1920 and 21 came by, these treaties, such as the Treaty of Saint Germain, the Treaty of Service, and the Treaty of Trianon, and other treaties that would then split up and break up German territory, including the establishment of Czechoslovakia, Austria as a republic, Hungary as a republic, and especially the establishment of Poland would really put a dent in Germany. So one of the things that Adolf Hitler says, which I think is a really interesting thing, is in Mein Kampf, which I am going to get to in our last slide. We will talk a little bit about that book. Um, Adolf Hitler says that after the war, he was an intelligence officer for the German army, so the Weimar army, and he was ordered to go to a meeting in Bavaria at a beer hall, and the meeting was of the German Workers' Party, and he was supposed to observe the party and report back whether or not this was kind of like an insurrectionist party, what they were thinking about doing. Were they trying to, tear down and dismantle the Weimar? I will say that there's a lot of things that Adolf Hitler has said about his life and about his even his religious beliefs and so forth that makes him an unreliable narrator. I don't think this is controversial, but I know that a lot of people will say Adolf Hitler was a devout Catholic, not really according to private communications that he had in private conversations. By the way, when I usually say that, people say, "Oh, well, Hitler wasn't an atheist either." There's more to life than being just a Roman Catholic or an atheist. I disagree highly with people like Christopher Hitchens and Michael Shermer that because Hitler said he was a Catholic in a letter to the Finnish prime minister, Mannheimer in 1944, that he was. Nazis were definitely trying to get rid of Christianity, but they also had their own religion called Nazism, which was a blending of mostly neo paganism, something called positive Christianity and other things. And Hitler and the Nazis, had they won World War II, at least according to Office of Strategic Services reports that were taken out of Hitler's bunkers, was that uh, had Hitler won the war, they would have probably gotten rid of the Catholic and the Protestant churches. And in fact, many churches in the Third Reich, pictures of Jesus in Catholic and Protestant churches were taken down, especially starting in the 30s. Hitler's picture was put up in their place, and crucifixes were taken down, and swastikas were put in their place. So the churches were essentially kept, but they were nationalized. And the idea that there would be a slow transition towards this Nazi religion. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who believes in a creator or everyone who believes in paganism is as bad as Hitler, but Hitler wasn't a Catholic. He also committed suicide, married a Protestant, wasn't married by a priest. So it is an argument that people make. I just happen to take the other side of it. And that's why my point being, he's an unreliable narrator. So I think that Hitler went to the party, possibly because he was interested in finding himself or finding a solution to why things were going on, as many Germans did. And in this particular meeting, in his first meeting in September of 1919, the topic in the beer hall of the German Workers' Party meeting was whether or not Bavaria should join in a union with Austria or Germany. Last week, I talked to you about the Kurt Eisner and the People's State of Bavaria. It was just starting at this time. And so many people in Bavaria thought maybe Bavaria should stay in Germany, or maybe they thought that they could join in a union with Austria. And again, this was the discussion of this particular meeting. Now, after this infamous meeting, it was Anton Drexler who was at the meeting, again, being one of the founders of this party. He met Adolf Hitler and he offered him membership into the party. And why was because Hitler was passionately debating a professor. Now, I know people have seen growing up how Hitler was a speaker. Obviously, he put his speaking talents to a positive message, the world would be definitely a different place. But we can kind of look at some of the passion that Hitler had. And so Drexler noticed this. He noticed that he was very animated, and he offered him again membership. So about a year-ish later, in 1920, Adolf Hitler would roll through the ranks to become the head of the German Workers' Party. And in 1920, he added the words National Socialist. And then the party would be called NSDAP, NSDAP, Nationalsozialismus Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, a long mix of words that we just call today the Nazi Party. And the term National Socialist was meant to confuse people and to draw in both nationalist people from the right and socialists from the left. They're also, interestingly enough, talk about Hitler being an unreliable narrator. He did say in the 20s that he was a socialist. I don't think that he was in the left-wing sense. I think he was trying to create a national socialism, but in the end, he is an unreliable narrator because even though I've talked about Marxism, Leninism, all these different types of socialism, there's definitely massive amounts of ideological differences. For one, as I mentioned before, is egalitarianism. And non-egalitarian socialism doesn't exist, whether we think or believe in socialism or the goals of it or not, whether we think or believe in that it's realistic or not. Um, definitely Nazism has more to do with far right. Some would say fascism. Some would say it isn't fascism, but certainly today We would put like communism, especially Stalinism and Mark and so forth, on what we would call far left authoritarianism, and we would put Nazism and fascism on far right. So again, it's very complicated. I could get into the weeds, but at the same time, just know that this is how the Nazi Party was established. From a Poet is on. Hey, from a poet. I don't know if you were had heard before, but when I do my PowerPoints, I have to go to full screen, so I don't see the chat. But I just want to say hello from a poet. Thank you so much for being here. This is very kind of you. Germans were screwed, and it came back around. Yeah, bit the world in the ass. Absolutely. Yep. Eventually, eventually, Hitler found his people. He found the people whom gave him that simple excuse that the Germans lost the war because of the Jews. Um, and if we could only just protect German workers, and then whatever it evolved. Hitler, of course, was a visual artist by trade. I've read a real it's old now, it's from the 70s, but there's a big, thick biography from a German historian named Joachim Fest called Hitler. And I think it's like one of the first, has to be, I think, the first or one of the first biographies written by Hitler from a German historian. And it's a thick book, but looking at his life as a child, he sang in the choir, but he actually hated church. His father was anti-religious. His mother was devout. He had a sister who changed her name after the war. I mean, the study of what that man did will be, you know, something for the ages, for better or for worse. Obviously, the world would be better if he didn't exist, but he did. And as someone who unfortunately had family members that I didn't know because they were victims of the Holocaust, stuff like this is still very important today in our current political climate, and will be important in the future. I just hope that people look at these times, and I can give some good books, some good recommendations later to sort of help us try to understand how someone like Hitler can come to power using the scapegoating and the propaganda and all this kind of stuff. But I digress again. Thank you, Brian, for being here. All right, back to full screen. The next one, we talk about Judaism. We talk about Jewish people, and I hinted at this last week, which was we have these four individuals that I talked about last week. What do they all have in common? So Kurt Eisner was the first president of the Free State of Bavaria from November 1919 until November 1918 until April of 1919, when it then became the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Eugene Levine was the second president of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Rosa Luxemburg was the founder of the Spartacus League, which of course led to the Spartacus uprising in Berlin in January between the 5th and the 15th of January 1919. And Ernst Toller was the first president of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. I think he only lasted 3 or 4 days, and then Eugene Levine was elected. Well, unfortunately for these four, not only were they scapegoats, not only were they communists, progressive socialists, but they were all Jewish. And of course, this is where collective guilt and collective discrimination come in. It's funny today when we demonize a group of people. And again, being Jewish, but I can separate that. We say everyone in a group is a this or that. And there's a lot of people who have said that about Jewish people, said that about Muslims, we say that about Christians, we say that about everybody, that all of them are fill in the blank, you know, dehumanizing term. Well, at one point, especially about 100 years ago, all Jews were communists. And there were terms like cultural Marxism, cultural Bolshevism, and Judeo Bolshevism. because Karl Marx, his father was Jewish. So, of course, that means every Jew has to be a communist. Of course, according to tradition, your mother has to be Jewish. You have to be born to a Jewish mother to be Jewish. But again, logic, reason, facts, when people hate someone, they'll, take any excuse to just hate them. And so, yes, unfortunately for these individuals, not only were they Jewish, but all Jews were blamed. Communism, Marxism were considered a Jewish conspiracy theory. And many on the German right, like Hitler, Anton Drexler, I mentioned people like Martin Bormann, Rudolf Hess, um, Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Heinrich Himmler, Ernst Röhm, they all associated with collective guilt. And so this was a huge issue for the Jewish people who were getting scapegoated and lumped into being communists. And therefore, if they were communists, they were enemy of the state, essentially. So there was not just happens, right? This, racism, discrimination, ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination, and anti-Semitism did not come out of nowhere. It had been consistent in German society. Some would say even when the Ashkenazi Jews came to the Holy Roman Empire in the ninth century or so forth. And you can go back and look at and listen and watch my video on the Jewish movements and denominations. There had been a lot of expulsions of Jewish communities from every part of Europe and Russia and so forth for about a millennia. But by the 18th and especially the 19th century, as revolution builds, and I would like to do, and um, I'm going to make some PowerPoints in the next upcoming weeks. After next week, I'll do the ethnic Russian one, but in the next preceding weeks, I'd like to do one on the 1848 revolution, Spring of Nations, and then Italian and German unification, which I think will be two different ones. So I have kind of three ideas for the future. But many of German nationalists and even Italian nationalists were organizing themselves into secret societies because, of course, the monarch, the king, the prince, the duke, they couldn't just openly be nationalists. They were still subjects to that kind of feudalist or neo feudalist system. And so one of these was called the Trula Society. I believe that Anton Drexler was actually a member. I'm pretty sure he was. If he wasn't, I do think that there were a lot of people like in the German Workers' Party and certain like the Fatherland Party and a lot of important German nationalists. Some would become Nazis, and of course, in the future. And the Trula Society, look at its symbol. I'm not exactly sure, like, if there's a through line between this type of swastika and Hitler's swastika of the Third Reich, but it's definitely inspired in some ways. I think, in fact, Hitler was aware of the Trula Society. I believe he wanted to become a member, never did. But for someone like him, just a lonely artist on the street, if he had become a member of that society, it would have been pretty prestigious. So this was this secret society, and this is also something where when we talk about things like neo-German paganism, which I know is not the same as actual German paganism. Talking about now the Nazis' misinterpretation of paganism. There were rituals and things like this that these secret societies, like the Trula Society, did that we can see were very influential in what Hitler and the high ranking Nazis wanted to organize to then take over Christianity. I also forgot to mention 2,000 Catholic priests and a whole load of Protestant ministers that defied Hitler, that defied his nationalization of religion, were murdered, in the camps, including I think 2 to 3,000 Catholic priests, and also a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a socialist, progressive, what they call a social gospel preacher. He was Lutheran. And there's a big, thick book called Bonhoeffer, and you can look up what happened to him. He was sent to a concentration camp and murdered. So, regardless, there was this definitely occultic, esoteric, kind of religion that they were trying to create, and some of those, the basis of some of that does come from the Chula Society. We then throw in the mix of eugenics, which comes out of England, coined in 1883 by Sir Francis Galton, which then categorizes humans into races. Some of them, of course, like the Aryans and the white people, being more superior to the impure peoples like Jews, as well as blacks, Italians, people who are indigenous to North and South America, Slavs, etc. And again, I know a lot of this is review. I know a lot of this is taught in high school, but of course, it's just small review. But the highest race, as we all know, and again for review, according to Hitler, was the Aryans. The Aryans, interestingly enough, were a people group. The Aryans were an Indo-European people group. So the Indo-European speakers, their life begins somewhere in the Caucasus, somewhere between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And this is where, Indo-European languages come from. And I did a whole thing on that in previous stuff. You can look at my Hungarian language history, my Romanian language history. I talk about that a lot. But there was a group called the Indo-Aryans, and in fact, the language that we associate with Indo-Aryans is Sanskrit, so languages like Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Assamese, Nepali, um, Gujarati, Punjabi, Sinhalese, Marathi, and so on are all called Indo-Aryan. But of course, based on really bad pseudoscience and scientific racism, he believed that the Aryans were the pure race that were blonde haired, blue eyed, many of them coming from northern Germany, Scandinavia, etc., which of course Hitler himself was not even blonde hair and blue eyed. So, this perversion of science, this horrible, horrible, terrible thing also stemmed from eugenics. Let me just see if there's any more questions here. So, yeah, Poet says it's real easy. Yep, to us, a scapegoat to come to power. Yeah, here in the US. Yep. I think this kind of stuff is interesting, always interesting, but I think that again, I don't want to get into politics because it's more like person. I don't like a particular person. It doesn't matter about their party. It doesn't matter about the people, who vote for that. So specifically partisan politics. But yeah, it's important. And again, I'll give a book if you want to read after this that really I think is very good on this subject. And Peter Anderson, my buddy, what's going on? Guten Tag to you too. Very fitting, of course. Hope you're enjoying it, Peter. Hope you enjoy. Thank you again. Thank you, Brian, very much for being on here. I just have a couple more slides, and then again, I'll get into my conclusion. But following this, we have two particular events, which are known as pooches, which kind of sounds like the colloquial nickname for a dog, like Pooch or Poochie. And of course, Poochie reminds me of The Simpsons. When Poochie's not around, everyone should be saying, "Where's Poochie?" I had to. Um, but in this case, we have two pooches, which were essentially insurrections. The first was the Cap Pooch, which was started and organized by a gentleman named Herr Kapp, which took place in Berlin in the 13th of March of 1920. Well, what's interesting about this is the Spartacist uprising, which took place also in Berlin, happened just 14 months, so 1 year and 2 months prior. That's really not a long time, and it happened in the city. So, in 14 months, Berlin had a communist uprising that was violently taken down by the Freikorps. And 14 months later, a large group of very right wing nationalists and monarchists go to the capital of the Weimar Republic because they are essentially creating an insurrection. So the Kapp Putsch was an attempted coup that took place in Berlin. The goals and the aims was to overthrow the Weimar Republic and establish an autocratic and nationalist driven government. And of course, it says it was supported heavily or heavily supported by nationalist and monarchist factions. At this time, the last Kaiser of the German Empire, who was Kaiser Wilhelm II, went into exile into the Netherlands, and Kapp and many other people wanted the Kaiser to come to this rally and to force his way back into power because of what was going on with the weakness of the Weimar state. Now, of course, as we know from history, the Kaiser Wilhelm II did not leave the Netherlands. He stayed there at a place called House Doorn, which I believe is in North Holland. Someone can check that out for me. It's not in Amsterdam, but it's like south of there, I think. Someone can check that out again. And I believe he died there. And I can't remember the year that he died there, but regardless, this was a failed attempt. But I just want to sort of notice some of these aims, which are very important, the intentions, and of course, the fact that this happens only 14 months after the communist takeover. And I just think that that's a very interesting, could be coincidental, whatever. I kind of believe in what's called the history of causality, which you can look at from my schools of thought and history PowerPoint. But I sort of believe in a cause and effect. It's just my opinion, and I just think it's interesting from that perspective. The next putsch, which is very influential, especially to the rise of Adolf Hitler, is the infamous beer hall putsch, which took place in Munich from the 8th to the 9th of November 1923. In this case, about 4.5 years after the Bavarian Soviet Republic is established. And I guess we could say it's roughly 4 years and a month after Adolf Hitler joins the German Workers' Party, and around 3 years after he becomes its president and adds National Socialist to German Workers' Party. In the photo on the left, we can see Adolf Hitler leading the march of the Nazis. I think they were called brown shirts back then, I'm pretty sure. So this is his rally, again, kind of an insurrection. And he's there out in front, leading to the I believe it was the Parliament building or the main city hall building in Munich. And his intention was to take over, and to take over not the Weimar Republic in Berlin, which Kapp was trying to do, Herr Kapp, but to institute himself into the Bavarian state. So here are some aims of intentions. Now, these are some people. I'm going to, give you their names. Some of these people's names were eventually purged and lost to history, but there are some interesting names on here. So first of all, there was a head Nazi with the name Punner, and during the putsch, he was supposed to, when they were supposed to take over Bavaria, he was to be named prime minister with dictatorial powers. Another Nazi named Carr was to become the state administrator. He himself, so Hitler, was going to take over the presidency of a new national government. Now, Ludendorff was the famous General Ludendorff, who was a World War I general who, after the war, became a Nazi and supported the Nazis. He was going to, of course, command an army that was going to march on Berlin. This was in reminiscence of Mussolini's march to Rome, which I believe took place either the year before or 2 years before. I've forgotten exactly when, it was either 1921 or 1923, and that was the aim. So the aim was to march on Bavaria, take over, and march on Rome, or march on Berlin rather, and take over. And then some other guy named Seisser would become the minister of the police. Now, of course, they were unsuccessful. So Hitler's arrest and the publishing of Mein Kampf. So the reason for Hitler's arrest was on the second day, on the 9th of November, of 1923, during the insurrection, during the march, whatever you want to call it, somebody fired a shot. They still don't know whom, whether it was a spectator, a police officer, or a member of the Nazi Party. But there was roughly 1 minute, 1 minute long firefight that lasted between the police. And afterwards, many of the Nazis were arrested, including Adolf Hitler. He would then be incarcerated and put in jail in Landsberg prison, which is roughly 40 miles from the city of Munich in Bavaria. While awaiting trial on treason, Hitler, of course, writes Mein Kampf, which then popularizes his anti Semitic and xenophobic beliefs. And in February of 1924, Hitler is sentenced or was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was eligible for parole after 6 months. He did not serve 5 years in prison. I think he was let out shortly after. And one of the other things that I do want to say about Mein Kampf, which here we can see this is the second edition of the book circa 1926, is as most Germans who were alive at the time, and I did grow up and I did know along the way people that had copies of Mein Kampf in their home during the war. And I also know this from living in Germany, living in Berlin with Scientology, and also knowing people who were German and so forth. And again, knowing people, for example, who were part of the Hitler Youth, who eventually came to Canada, and I knew them because they were my grandfathers or whatever of people I went to school with, and they spoke about their experiences in school. And obviously, they were not Nazis. They recognized the errors of their way. But one of the most, I guess, interesting in a very sad way, in a very ironic way, was that most Germans really couldn't make sense of Mein Kampf. And I've read Mein Kampf. I've tried. It's obviously very hard being Jewish, but it's a very difficult read because Hitler was not a good writer. He was it's incredibly all over the place. The writing is bad, the grammar is bad. It's really sadly, and this should not be a surprise, the ramblings of someone with a very sick mind. And so even Germans are would declare that most of them did not read past page 20, and yet in the next upcoming decade, the ideology contained in this book, the sale of this book, okay, would be very popular not only in Germany, but in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and a lot of places in Europe. And even today, there are a lot of countries like Turkey and in the Middle East where Mein Kampf is in the top 10 best selling books every year. And that's obviously a very horrific thing. It is still, for example, sold in bookstores and white supremacist groups all over the world, Germany, England, Eastern Central Europe, US and Canada, people still buy this thing. So it is still being sold. I've read it from a historical perspective. I when I was in my undergrad, we had a couple copies in there. So it's kind of tough because obviously it's a book of so much hatred, so much confusion, and so much just horrible, disgusting things. It should be read, but it's also being, of course, read by people who actually believe in this nonsense. So that is my last slide. Let me go back here. Thank you, everyone, for that. Um, 1 year. Pete says 1 year of German in high school, and I still had to check the spelling. Yeah, my struggle exactly. It means my struggle. Mein Kampf. I had to read it for a European history course taught by a woman that was 3 during World War II. Brian says never read it, never had the desire to. Don't worry, you're not missing anything at all. Clarification, the instructor was 3 years old from Germany and horrified that her childhood home was bombed by the Allies. Listen, they bombed Dresden, they bombed lots of places. And yeah, a lot of German civilians were killed in places like Dresden and Essen and Bonn and Berlin. I mean, Hamburg, also Rotterdam, Budapest, Warsaw, and that was the whole thing, was to slow down the Germans, and to put a dent into their, especially with Dresden. This is where a lot of industry was, and a lot of armaments were being uh, uh, you know um, made and constructed in Dresden. So it was one of these necessary evil type things that I still think is a good historical debate even to this time. But yeah, that was my last slide. The book I want to recommend, you can find it on Audible if you like audiobooks. It's called The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard Evans, which I do believe I listed it in my very early live that I did a few weeks back, or maybe a couple months ago, I should say, when I talked about book recommendations. I'm pretty sure I put it on that book recommendation. But that is Richard Evans is an English British scholar. I think again from either Cambridge, Oxford, but he's got a lot of amazing books like The Nazis at War. But The Coming of the Third Reich is really gets into this kind of thing. The establishment, especially then, I've only talked from, the post World War One until let's say 1924, 25 ish. And his goes from the 20s through the Depression, and then of course into the 30s. And the last thing I want to close with is really the most influential election that we get taught about, when Hitler actually becomes the chancellor, is in 1933. So what's interesting about this is in March of 1933, there's an election, 5th of March. The Nazis seize power, and which was 6 days after the Reichstag fire, which they blame on communists. And the stormtroopers unleashed a campaign of violence against the Communist Party, left wingers, unionists, social democrats, and so forth. And one interesting fact is that this, meaning the March of 1933 election, was the last multi-party election in a united Germany until 1990. So, of course, West Germany after World War II had elections, but then they united afterwards. And so, East Germany did not have elections. At least if they did, they weren't free. So at the time, after Hitler is released, the party gets, into the public, the depression happens, and there's a series of elections in like the late 1920s and early 1930s where they can't form a government. And so in the last election, Hitler um, receives, I think it was 43% of the popular vote. He earns 288 seats in parliament. The election before, which was in 1932, he gains 92 seats. And pretty much it's not 50%, it's only anywhere from maybe a third to 40%. He's then, of course, appointed as Chancellor of Germany, so very similar to the Prime Minister, by a man named Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg dies in 1934. Hitler consolidates power between the Chancellor and the President, and then establishes the Third Reich a few years after, and the rest we say is history. So there are a lot of really interesting parallels that we can draw, important lessons, and it's just very interesting. As I say, The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard Evans is great. Please, if you want to know more, there's lots of other things. So let me just see here what Brian says. I need to tell you about the German Jewish guy I met in 2013 in New Mexico, and I was taking an American history class. Interesting dude. Was a tank operator in World War II for the U.S. Army. Yeah, tell me that in private. Yeah, lots of Jews, of course, served. Um, in fiction, if you watch Saving Private Ryan, Adam Goldberg's character, Private Mellish, is Jewish, which I think is interesting because he at one point shows his Star of David necklace and says, "I'm Juden," Juden, as a bunch of German prisoners are walking by. One of my heroes, although he didn't serve in the European theater, but one of my literary heroes is Rod Serling, the creator of The Twilight Zone, who I think is an amazing science fiction writer. He wrote 7 Days in May, I think was the movie with Kirk Douglas. And he also wrote the original Planet of the Apes, master of the twist ending, especially in some of those early Twilight Zone episodes, the glasses and all that, and the cookbook, and there was so much time now. Anyway, I'm a massive what they call zoner, and Rod Serling, who was Jewish, fought in the Philippines with a paratrooper unit, although they didn't parachute, but he was in a paratrooper unit, and he served in the Philippines during the Second World War. And there were quite a few. Yogi Berra is another one. And although many did go to Europe, they tried to make more Jews go over to the Pacific, especially if they didn't know Yiddish or German. If they knew Yiddish or German or French or some kind of or Polish or Hungarian, you were automatically go to Europe. But if you were sort of Jewish American and spoke English as your first language, like Rod, you probably would go especially if you were in the army. And of course, if you were in the Marine Corps, you would go to the Pacific. Marines didn't really operate in Europe, but they would go specifically over there. And Jews were not segregated, so they were in the regular army units, National Guard units, reserve units, Navy, regular Marine Corps, and of course, there was no Air Force at the time, as I'm sure you know. Brian, the Air Force wasn't established till 48, as I know you know. Air Force was, of course, part of the Army, the Army Air Corps. But those units were, not segregated, so Jews were considered white and whatnot. I could talk about the Twilight Zone all day. Maybe I will do a PowerPoint on the Twilight Zone. Actually, I think I should, because damn, are there some great episodes in that one. You talk about anyway, I could go on, and you know what? Maybe I will. I'll do some. I'll do. You know what? I think that's what I'll do. I'll maybe for next week or the week after, as I prepare for my more nationalism stuff. Maybe I'll do my top 5 Twilight Zone episodes and some of their morals of their stories and why they are why they pertain to today. Absolutely. There's some bad episodes, but even the bad ones I like. So, and there you go. Great uncle was Army Air Corps, radar unit North Africa through Italy, and great stories, of course. Oh my God. Stuck the yes, the Howling Man. Yep, 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 yep. I remember that one very well. Very, very well. That is a very, I think, a very scary, very horrific. I mean, there's a lot of horror-based episodes um, in um, in the Twilight Zone, but the Howling Man is. Whew. All right, everyone. So again, please join me on Wednesday, same time, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. UK time zone. And I will put up the topic for probably just in a few minutes, if not by tomorrow. Please check my community tab. Again, I'll put up 2 topics that we can talk about. And I'll meet you on Wednesday to talk about those things. Next week, as I said before, we will be talking about ethnic Russian minority groups and Russian minorities in the former Soviet states, so the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and so forth. I hope you join me. That'll be about statistics, a little economics, a tiny bit culture, and we'll talk also about separatist movements, breakaway states, and some of their impact on European geopolitics. So, thank you so much, everyone. Again, appreciate you being here. Chad, hey, Chad, I just wanted to throw that up. I'm glad you made it. I know I'm just about to end, but scrub back there, Chad, and definitely, you know, hit the replay. So, Irish, thank you. You're always here. I enjoy that so much. You're a huge supporter. I thank you so much for your time. I hope that you enjoyed it and liked it, Irish. We've got Power Lines here who's come here. We've got Pete, we've got Brian, we've got Chad, And anyone else that I've missed on the replay or was here, came, and whatever, please like the video if you haven't already. Please subscribe to my channel. As I said, I'm slowly getting some traction. You know, surpassing 1,000 views, close to 250 watch hours, 120 subscribers. I'm very happy with it. I'm very hopeful and happy that everyone's learning. I love doing stuff like this. And again, this is kind of a very important part of history that I wanted to share for a while with some really great people. So thank you. If you have any questions, comments, and concerns, write them, and I will get back to you when I can. So please also look at my community tab. I'm going to put two ideas up for next Wednesday. I will see you then. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.